So I'm a behavioral neuroscientist, and one of the questions that I've been interested in for a long time is what the role of drugs are in our brain and in our societies. And so for a long time, we've sort of had this definition difference. This is a medicine, this is a drug. And students will often come into the classroom and think, oh, well, medicines are good things, drugs are bad things. But of course, the reality is some things that are labeled medicine are remarkably close to other things that are labeled drugs and thought of as some of the worst compounds in our society. Take, for example, the new research that's coming out on treatments for depression using things like psilocybin and LSD. These are labeled Schedule I drugs by the government, which means they have no therapeutic benefit. Remarkably, however, in recent clinical trials, we found that these drugs are actually quite much more effective than the current standards of treatments for things like depression. So what's going on here? Why is a drug suddenly now a medicine, and a medicine might actually be a drug because now we discover that things like antidepressants might actually have withdrawal symptoms when people stop using them? The obvious answer here is actually that there is no real difference between medicines and drugs. And so what I like to be able to do is go into the classroom in classes like psychopharmacology and really start to unpack these assumptions that we make when thinking about drugs and how they work in our brains. Often our society has become obsessed with this idea that there is a pill for every treatment or every condition that you might have. And so we say, well, if you have depression, take an antidepressant and voila, your depression is solved. Of course, we know that the actual situation is much more complicated. Some individuals take an antidepressant and they never struggle with depression again the rest of their lives. Others might go through 5, 10 treatments of depression with different drugs and never really find a solution to it. Why is that? Is a really complicated question, and it brings into question some of these assumptions that we have about how drugs work in our brain. Take, for example, just here, my toy brain here. This is labeled with all sorts of different things like motor speech over here, language, moving your finger, your sensory cortex, so the feeling of touch and things like this. When you put a drug into a brain, it's going to go all over this brain and affect all of those systems, and often in unpredictable ways. So we may know that a certain drug, take LSD for example, is going to strongly activate 5-HT2A receptors, which are serotonin receptors in your brain. But those receptors are spread all across the brain, and they're going to affect every individual in slightly different ways because no two brains are alike. Further, I think one of the most underappreciated things in our society is the effect of something called set and setting on what drugs are going to do. What I mean by set is the expectations or the internal state of the individual who is taking the drug. What do you think is going to happen when you take this drug? What's your recent history of your mood or your behaviors or your thoughts or actions that might sort of have shaped your brain in such a way that that drug is going to act in a very specific way in your brain? By setting, what I mean is what was the environment in which you took the drug, right? You could take the same drug in a doctor's office or in a back alleyway, and you might imagine that those two different settings are going to greatly affect how you experience the drug. Now you may say, oh, well, that's superficial. It really just matters what's actually happening in the brain with the drug going and binding onto little pieces of your brain and doing specific things. But I think they're actually quite equal in their effect. Both how we think about a drug and actually what our brain is and how it's going to bind to those things in our brain are equally important. And so what I think is really cool about a place like SPU is we have the time in these classes to really examine what are the assumptions we make about medicines and drugs. How do they affect us? And what is the role in both making things better and making things worse for drugs in our society?